The distant rumble of artillery fire echoed through the sky, drowning out the clamor of boots on dirt and the sound of men's voices, mostly frantic, some in a sharp whisper, others in hushed cries of pain. The war had been grinding on for days, turning the land into a living nightmare, and still, the soldiers pushed forward, inching their way through the muddy quagmire of a battle that seemed as endless as it was senseless. The wind had a strange bite to it, colder than expected for the season, and every gust felt like it was gnawing at their bones. But what stung the worst was the dust, a constant, choking presence that filled their lungs and coated their gear. It made it hard to see, hard to think, just like the war itself. In the midst of this chaos, hiding beneath the tattered remains of a once proud military vehicle, was a man who, to most, seemed out of place. His name was Tom. At 56, he was older than the other men around him, and his eyes, though still sharp, reflected more years than they cared to admit. His hands, calloused and worn from a lifetime of labor, had never been meant for the weapons of war. He was just a mechanic, or so he had thought, until the world came crashing down and swept him into this madness. Tom's role was simple: fix the machines, keep them running. When the war started, he was just another cog in the great machine, patching up tanks and trucks, making sure they could roll on. But over time, that had changed. The machine itself had become the battlefield, and now it was Tom's job to survive. He had never signed up to be a hero, but life doesn't always ask permission before tossing you into the fire. The soldiers around him, young, full of fire, still carrying the eagerness of youth, often forgot about Tom, often left him in the background, dealing with nuts, bolts, and the humdrum of maintenance while they faced the front lines. They didn't see him as one of them. To them, he was a relic of a different era, a man who was better suited for the quiet, steady work of building things, not breaking them down in a field of blood and dirt. But in that moment, under the wreckage of what used to be a tank, Tom's experience, the quiet wisdom that had come from years of mechanical work, was more valuable than the weapons those young men carried. Tom's heart raced as he clutched the cold metal of his rifle, lying flat beneath the tank's charred belly, trying to steady his breathing. The ground around him was soaked with the stench of burning oil, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke. His body was buried in the muck, his ears ringing from the blast that had nearly taken out the whole platoon. The enemy was closing in. They could hear their footsteps, the scrape of boots on gravel, just a few meters away. In the chaos of the battlefield, Tom had hidden himself and a few others, a couple of young soldiers, one wounded, another, a civilian volunteer, clutching a radio that had long since lost its signal. They had been forced into this hiding place when everything went sideways. The shelling had been relentless, the ground beneath them trembling as if it were alive. And then, in the confusion, the tank had exploded. They hadn't been able to escape in time, but they had gotten low, crawling underneath the wreckage, praying the enemy would overlook them. Tom's mind flashed back to the days when he had been a boy, working with his father on the farm. It was there that he had learned the importance of patience and quiet observation, skills that had served him well over the years. In the midst of this hell, it was the same principles that kept him alive now. The younger soldiers were frantic, their faces tight with fear. The wounded one, he couldn't have been more than 20, was breathing shallowly, his eyes wide and glazed. There was no telling how long they could stay hidden. The enemy would find them soon enough, and when they did, it would be over. "What do we do now, Tom?" one of the soldiers whispered urgently, his voice cracking. The question was meant for reassurance, but it carried the weight of desperation. Tom didn't answer immediately. He looked around, scanning the wreckage. There was a twisted piece of metal sticking out of the ground, its jagged edges glinting under the moonlight. He could hear the sound of men approaching. The faint click of rifle triggers, the low murmur of orders being given. It was too close. "Stay low," Tom muttered, barely loud enough for them to hear. He knew that the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that the enemy would spot them. But he also knew that if they moved too soon, it would be worse. The soldier's doubt was palpable, he could feel it, but Tom kept his voice steady. "We wait. Just a little longer." Minutes felt like hours. The sound of enemy voices grew louder, then faded as they moved past, oblivious to the four hidden beneath the wreckage. Tom's muscles screamed in protest as he held himself as still as possible, his breath shallow. He could feel the weight of the world bearing down on him, the pressure of lives depending on his next move. Then, a sound, a snap of a twig, made his heart stop. Tom's breath caught in his throat. One of the enemy soldiers had wandered too close. Tom's mind raced. He was old, but he had been in sticky situations before. His hands weren't as steady as they once were, but his eyes had sharpened over the years. His instinct told him the soldier was too close, and if they didn't act fast, they were done for. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for the old flare gun that had been stashed in the corner of the wreckage, an old tool from a time long before the enemy's drone-filled skies. There was a spark of hope, just a small one, inside him. This was what he was good at, after all. Not the front lines, not the violence, but survival. And sometimes that meant playing the long game. He looked to the young soldier, then to the volunteer. They nodded. Tom fired the flare into the sky. The flare shot into the sky, a streak of red light slicing through the night, illuminating the wreckage around them. The sky lit up for a moment, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. The enemy soldiers who had been near the wreckage froze, looking up, their faces pale and shocked by the sudden appearance of the flare. In that moment of confusion, Tom's instincts kicked in, and he signaled for the group to move quickly. The flare was meant to distract, to confuse, but it would only work for so long. The enemy would regroup, and they would be searching for them in minutes. Tom's mind worked fast, sifting through the limited options they had. They couldn't stay under the wreckage much longer. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. "Get the wounded to the other side of the tank," Tom whispered urgently, his voice low and strained. He nodded toward the barely conscious soldier. "We'll use the wreckage as cover, but we can't stay here. The flare will only buy us a few minutes." The young soldier, whose face was pale from both fear and injury, nodded shakily, lifting the wounded soldier with the help of the volunteer. Tom turned his attention to the broken radio the civilian had been clutching. It had been quiet for hours, and it was no good for communication. Still, Tom's mind raced. There had to be a way to use it. They were in enemy territory, and they needed to send a signal, or they'd be sitting ducks, waiting for an inevitable death sentence. "Do you think it still works?" the volunteer asked hesitantly, seeing Tom's hands move toward the radio. "I'll make it work," Tom replied, though he didn't know how. He'd worked on radios for years back in the States, long before he was ever thrown into this war. He knew how to fix things, how to bend broken machines to his will. His hands weren't as steady as they once were, but his mind was still sharp, sharper than some of the young men he'd worked alongside. In moments like these, it wasn't the latest gadget or the newest technology that mattered. It was the wisdom of knowing how to make something work, no matter how old or out of date it seemed. Tom pulled open the radio's casing carefully. The circuits inside were fried from the heat of the flare and the smoke from the wreckage, but he could see the wiring, the old-school parts that he recognized from his time back home. He muttered to himself as he fiddled with the wires, bypassing damaged components. He worked in silence, sweat dripping from his forehead, the sound of distant enemy patrols growing louder. He knew they didn't have much time. Every second counted. "Tom, what are we doing?" The voice of the young soldier broke through his concentration. He sounded desperate, and rightfully so. The whole situation was falling apart. The flare had been a temporary distraction, but now they were exposed. The enemy was still close, and they had no way of knowing how many more were closing in on them. Tom didn't answer at first. He knew the pressure was mounting. The weight of the lives around him rested on his shoulders. They were counting on him, not the young soldiers with their weapons, but on him, the man who knew how to fix things, to make the impossible happen. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the radio crackled to life. "Hello!" A voice came through the static. It was distant, faint, but unmistakable. Tom's heart raced as he gripped the device, feeling the sweat on his palms. "We're here," Tom replied, his voice low but steady. "We need extraction now. We're pinned down. We'll be overrun if you don't hurry." He could hear a sharp intake of breath on the other side of the radio. There was a pause, followed by a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone in charge. "Hold tight. We've got an extraction team coming. Just hold on. Not enough, Tom muttered under his breath. Not enough time. The extraction would take time. Too much time. The enemy would be on them long before that. Tom knew the odds. There was no way they would be able to stay hidden long enough for help to arrive. They needed a diversion, something bold, something that would throw the enemy off their trail for just long enough. How much ammo do we have? Tom asked, his eyes scanning the wreckage, calculating. We've got a few clips, the young soldier replied, sounding unsure. Not much. It wasn't enough. But it was all they had. Tom didn't hesitate. He turned to the group, his voice calm but firm. Listen to me. We can't just wait. If we sit here, they'll find us. We need to create a diversion, draw them away from the wreckage. The civilian volunteer looked at him skeptically, his eyes wide with fear. How are we supposed to do that? We're not soldiers. We're sitting ducks. We'll make them think we're somewhere else, Tom said, his voice low but full of conviction. We'll lure them into an ambush. The idea wasn't perfect, but it was their only shot. Here's the plan, Tom continued, outlining the strategy quickly. He wasn't sure if the others were entirely convinced, but they didn't have much of a choice. Tom had always been good at making people believe in the impossible, at seeing possibilities where others saw only walls. Now was no different. They would use the enemy's expectations against them. If they made noise, if they lit the flare again, if they created enough of a distraction, the enemy would think the group had moved to a different part of the battlefield. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be without risk, but it was their only shot. Once we move, we stay low. We stay quiet. We'll use the terrain to our advantage, Tom ordered. They'll be looking for us at the wreckage. We use that to slip past them. The group nodded, though there was clear doubt in their eyes. They were scared, and rightly so. But there was no other choice. Let's move, Tom said. They crawled from their hiding place, using the wreckage as cover. Every step felt like an eternity, every sound magnified in their ears. The ground was muddy, the air thick with the smell of burning debris, but they kept moving. Tom led them through the darkness, moving with a purpose, using the skills he had honed over years of being overlooked and underestimated. This wasn't about fighting. It wasn't about bravery in the traditional sense. This was about survival. And Tom was the only one who knew how to make that happen. As they neared a cluster of rocks, Tom could hear the faint sound of footsteps again. He motioned for the group to stop, holding his breath, hoping they wouldn't be heard. Stay down, Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. This is it. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing across the war-torn landscape. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, each beat seeming to shake him to the core. The small group huddled behind the rocks, their bodies pressed low to the ground, hidden in the shadows of the night. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment it felt as if the world had stopped spinning. Just them and the enemy soldiers, moving closer and closer. Tom's eyes flicked to the wounded soldier, still unconscious, breathing shallowly. He had to make sure they didn't get caught. He couldn't afford to fail them now. He glanced at the civilian volunteer, whose knuckles were white from clutching the radio, and then to the young soldier who was still holding his rifle tightly, his eyes wide with fear. Tom had seen the fear in young soldiers before. It was the kind of fear that paralyzes a person, makes them doubt every decision, every move. But Tom had lived through enough of his own battles, in wars long past, to know that fear could be conquered. It wasn't easy, but it could be done. And tonight, in the middle of this God-forsaken battlefield, they had to conquer it. Stay low. Stay quiet, Tom whispered, his voice barely audible, his words a steady command. When they pass us, we move. You follow my lead, and we don't stop until we're clear. The enemy soldiers were close now, their voices carrying through the darkness. Tom could hear the scrape of boots on gravel, the rustle of movement. He held his breath, willing the group to remain still, to be one with the night. The footsteps paused just a few yards away, and Tom's stomach twisted. They were so close now, so dangerously close. His fingers tightened around the flare gun, his backup plan, the only thing he had left to give them an edge if they were discovered. Seconds felt like minutes. The group held its breath, not daring to make a sound. Then, finally, the enemy soldiers began to move away, their voices fading as they walked farther from their hiding spot. Tom let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Now," he whispered. "Move." They crawled, as low to the ground as they could go, moving in small, deliberate movements. Each step felt like it might be their last. Tom's mind raced through every possibility, every move, every angle. He knew they couldn't stay out here much longer. They had to find a way to strike back, to create a diversion, or they'd be hunted down like animals. They reached the far edge of the rocks and moved quickly, following Tom's lead. The ground was rough beneath them, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. The terrain was treacherous, the night sky barely giving enough light to see their surroundings. But Tom's instincts, honed over decades of experience, guided them with precision. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the air. The sharp sound of a twig snapping underfoot. One of the soldiers had slipped. Tom's heart leapt into his throat. But before he could react, the sound was followed by a burst of rifle fire, coming from behind them. The enemy had spotted them. The group scattered. The young soldier with the rifle fired back, though it was clear that he was outmatched and outgunned. Tom, feeling his heart race, dove for cover behind a boulder, quickly assessing the situation. "We can't fight them head-on," Tom muttered to himself. "We need a plan, and fast." Then it hit him. He had one more trick up his sleeve, one last way to get them out of this alive. He turned to the civilian volunteer, who had the radio, and motioned for him to follow. "Get that flare gun ready," he said. "We need to draw them into a trap." Tom knew that if they could lure the enemy into a specific area, they could use the terrain to their advantage. The group wasn't large, and they were outnumbered, but there was one thing that Tom had learned over the years: battles weren't always won with firepower. Sometimes it was about strategy. And he knew just where to strike. "Cover me," Tom said, his voice sharp. "I'll set the trap. You follow my lead when I give the signal." With a deep breath, Tom crawled out from behind the rock, carefully inching his way toward the enemy's position. His hands were steady now, even though his heart was pounding. He knew the enemy would be looking for them in the wrong places, but he had to make sure they didn't see him coming. He could hear them moving around, searching for the group, getting closer. They were getting careless. Tom's fingers brushed the ground beneath him, and he smiled faintly. The uneven earth was just as he remembered, perfect for what he needed. He found a section of the battlefield where the enemy soldiers would have to pass, just under the cover of trees. He set the trap, an old trick, one he had used during his early days as a mechanic, using the environment to his advantage. The crackling sound of a branch snapping signaled that the enemy was just steps away from walking right into it. He held his breath. Then, without warning, Tom fired the flare gun into the air, the bright light casting a blinding flash over the area. The enemy soldiers, disoriented and startled by the flare's sudden appearance, hesitated for a moment. That was enough. Tom took the opportunity to roll behind cover and fired off a few rounds from his rifle, using the sound of the gunfire to mask the movement of the rest of the group as they moved toward their escape route. The enemy soldiers, now confused and shaken by the noise and sudden flashes of light, turned and began to retreat. The trap had worked, at least for the moment. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he saw the soldiers retreating, unsure of what had just happened. "We've got to go now," Tom shouted. "Move." The group didn't hesitate. They ran, faster than they had ever run before, with Tom leading them through the maze of rocks and trenches. The sound of the retreating enemy soldiers faded behind them, and the group emerged into an open space. Tom's breath was ragged, but they had made it. As they moved through the final stretch of the battlefield, Tom's eyes caught a glimpse of the horizon. The sky was starting to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. They were alive. They had made it. Tom's mind raced, but there was a sense of calm that washed over him. They had survived, not through brute force, but through wit, experience, and the determination to keep fighting, no matter the odds. He turned back to the group, his heart full of pride. They had doubted him at first, but now they understood. The young soldier gave him a weary but grateful look. "You did it," he said, his voice hoarse. Tom nodded, his face softening with a quiet smile. "We did it." As the light of day broke over the battlefield, Tom knew that the war was far from over. But for now, they had won. And for him, that victory was enough.